Here we go with Chapter 7. We're going to be looking at the Queen's Pawn game, including lines like the Tory for white, where they play d4, and it's not going to be a London, and there's not going to be a quick c4 after d4. How are you doing, Jesse?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to look into these types of positions because I get these in my games a lot, and I'm never quite sure how to handle it. So teach me your ways, Matt. So it'll start D4, D5, just as in our other chapters, and already we have a branching place, and we're going to look at 5 different moves here. Let's start with E3.
Yeah,
So this is called. Is this the Tory?
it's still just kind of called Queen Pawn game at this point. White
Okay.
could play c4 and try to transpose into a Queen's Gambit. But if
Okay.
they play like knight f3, then we're going into the Tory territory.
Territory.
Territory. Yes. Pun intended, definitely. So we're
All
going
right.
to
So
go with e6, just kind of keeping flexible and watching for transposition. So we kind of have this triangle set up in mind. If white goes c4, we can still go triangle. So here we're going to look at a few different moves. Bishop d3. We're also going to look at pawn to c4, pawn to f4, and knight to f3. So let's start with the most common, bishop to d3. And look at
and yep,
this.
we are going Dutch Stonewall, baby. So immediate f5. I think this is a good way to kind of exploit this bishop because now the bishop is just staring right into our pawns, and these pawns aren't going anywhere. So we immediately take away scope, and we're gonna just take white for a ride on our Dutch Stonewall. So f5. Most common move here is copying us f4.
And you know what's funny? I used to play this type of setup for white, like kind of the passive d4, e3. I played this during college when I didn't want to learn a lot of theory. And whenever I faced the stonewall, I would play f4. For that same reason, like I didn't want to see that f pawn coming at me in a big kingside pawn storm. So I would just try to block the f pawn. But now let's go for a more aggressive option. So if we see f4, we're going to recommend pawn to c5. And long term, what we're going to do here is we're going to try to keep this center locked up, and we're going to go for queenside expansion and play for an advantage on the queen side. So for example, let's say we get c4 in, we get a tempo on this bishop, and that's going to jumpstart our play on the queen side. So here the most common move by far is c3. And first let's start with developing the knights, and then we'll decide what to do with the pawns. So knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, all pretty natural developing moves. Castle for white, bishop to e7. In the notes here we say bishop to d6 is also playable. And now here, what's the most popular move for white at the club level?
So most popular move for white is actually knight e5. So it kind of makes sense bringing the knight right into the board, or right into the middle of the board rather. To my 1300 eyes, it seems it's a bit premature since they have all these pieces on the back rank kind of waiting to get into game. So there's no reason to take here and kind of give them a big dominant center. So we are going to castle. Most common move again, knight d2. And we have bishop d7 at this point. So I like this knight development already because we have both of our knights on the 6th rank behind pawns. So
Yeah,
very solid center here.
and that's one advantage for us with the pawn on c5 versus the pawn on c3. White doesn't have knight to c3 available. And another thing to mention, with this bishop to d7 move, we have this cool idea that's somewhat common in the Stonewall structure. We could actually bring this bishop back to e8 and then reroute it through h5 as a way to try to trade off this bad bishop. So it looks kind of funny, like why do you want to play bishop to d7? It looks like it's going nowhere. Well, we actually have this idea in mind, and the bishop is pointing queenside, so he may be able to help out with our queenside expansion. So now after knight d to f3, now we recommend c4. So one thing that I like to talk about when it comes to pawn tension like this is how many options each pawn has. And you've probably heard me mention this before, Jesse. But the white pawn has two options. It can either sit on d4 or capture. This black pawn has three options. It can sit on c5, it can capture, or push. So we have an advantage with this pawn tension, so that's why we sat on that for a while. We're always happy if white were to take us on c5, but we got all of our pieces developed first, got all the minors developed. Now we're going to go ahead and play c4, start this queenside expansion, and push for an advantage.
Yep, so c4 gives us a lot of space, putting another pawn on a light square, and we get a tempo on the bishop. So bishop c2, we're gonna go for this bishop retreating plan, and this would be like a dream scenario if we could pin the knight to the queen. So let's try to manufacture that. Bishop d2, white develops their last piece, and there it is, bishop h5. So this is a really clever way to get this bishop traded off. And worth noting, a few moves back, they could have taken our bishop, but we're totally fine with that since it's a bad piece anyway.
That's exactly right. So now after white tries to break the pin, most common move, queen e1, here we're recommending knight to e4. And this is the last move in the line. And at this point we have a comfortable advantage. So if I check Stockfish here, I'm seeing like minus 0.3, minus 0.4, maybe even slightly higher. And our plan now is going to be capture the knight on e5. So we're going to get rid of this knight on c6, which will allow us to start pushing this b pawn up the board. And once we get the b pawn going up the board, we have that queenside advantage in space. The center's all locked up, and essentially the king side is even. Neither side is playing on the king side. So really we have the only imbalance advantage in the position in terms of the pawn structure, and I think that's what's leading to that Stockfish advantage of about half a pawn for black.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we have a nice easy plan of pushing the b pawn and the a pawn even sometime too.
Yeah, I like this position a lot. I think it's very low risk. And this is the line where white tried to kill all of our fun. You know, we're playing the Stonewall and white tried to just play super boring, and we found a way to get an advantage with a quick c5. So that's what I really like about this line. So now let's go all the way back to move 3. So in this chapter we're going to have a lot of early deviations, right? Because these are all the possible queen pawn games essentially. So instead of bishop to d3, let's move to the next most popular move now, knight to f3. And one thing to keep in mind with this is it could transpose to a queen's gambit type setup still with pawn to c4. So our recommendation is going to be pawn to f5, and if they go pawn to c4, it's actually going to transpose to chapter 4, which is our Dutch and Queen's Gambit decline chapter. So we're not going to look at c4 here. Let's look at bishop to d3.
Yep, so white again is kind of voluntarily putting their bishop on a square that's pointing at our pawns. So after bishop d3, we're going to go with our expanded triangle setup, zigzag setup. Name it what you will. So yep. C6, solidifying our pawns on the light squares again. Most common move is castle, and it's time for us to start developing our pieces. Sadly, we don't have the c6 square for our knight, so we're going to bring it to d7. And I like developing the knight early because it's not really apparent what we want to do with our bishop. And this move also kind of keeps an eye on e5 if there wants to be, or if white wants to do an early knight jump.
And one thing to keep in mind here too is we could play knight h6. So like in the other chapter, sometimes we start with the early knight h6. But I kind of like that the d7 knight in this position particularly is watching over e5. So if there's a quick knight e5, we might just capture it here and give white some ugly pawns. So keep that in mind. Now the most common plan is b3, and we've seen this before in chapter 4. White wants bishop to a3, trying to trade off their bad bishop for our good bishop. So now we're going to play knight to h6, and this is very similar to what we've seen in the earlier chapters. Bishop to a3, bishop takes a3. Now one small difference here between this line and what we've seen in the previous chapters is the c2 pawn was on c4 previously, and because the c2 pawn was on c4, we can't play g5 yet because there's this threat of bishop takes f8, knight takes f8, and then knight e5, and the queen's coming out really fast. So it's just a strange difference. Because white didn't take the time to play c4, we're actually not quite ready to play g5. So that's in the notes, and if you're training this in Chessable, you'll have to kind of think about that difference. Is the pawn on c4 or not? So here we're going to take, knight takes, and now we go g5. And here comes our pawn storm. Are you ready for it, Jesse?
Yeah, very ready. I love seeing these.
So now c4 for white, and we're going to go g4, immediately kicking this knight. And after the knight retreats, knight d2, we're going to play queen to e7, which hits this knight. So now there's this choice for white. They need to either play queen c1 or retreat the knight off of a3. And we have this plan, knight f6, knight f7, h5, h4, h3, and attack the white king. So it's going to be on white to figure out how do they counter that very easy plan that we have coming up. Just move both knights and push the h-pawn all the way up the board.